I've always believed that the most terrifying stories aren't the ones with monsters hiding in the dark. They're the ones where the monster wears a suit, walks the halls of power, shakes hands with presidents, and tells the world he's protecting it, when in truth, he's controlling it. This is the story of J. Edgar Hoover, a man who built the FBI from the ground up and then used it as his personal empire. For nearly 50 years, he wasn't just a government official. He was a shadow over American democracy. He knew your name, your secrets, your fears, and he never let go. Today we're pulling back the curtain, not to sensationalize, not to shock, but to understand. To trace the quiet rise of a man who redefined the meaning of power and the devastating cost of unchecked authority. Because the scariest crimes are the ones we let happen. This is True Crime Echoes. Chapter 1. The Man Behind the Badge. You ever have one of those moments where you're watching the news or scrolling through some conspiracy rabbit hole and you suddenly wonder, wait, who's actually watching them? Like, who's watching the people in power, the ones running the country, pulling the strings, making the rules? That question hit me like a freight train when I started digging into the history of the FBI. Not just the FBI itself, but the man who pretty much was the FBI for nearly half a century, J. Edgar Hoover. His name came up over and over, and the deeper I went, the darker it got. I thought I was just going to learn about wiretaps and some Cold War stuff, maybe a few political scandals. But no. What I found was something way more complicated, way more personal, and honestly, way more disturbing. You see, growing up, I always thought the FBI was this untouchable organization, suits, badges, justice. That's how it's always shown in movies, right? A couple of sharp agents kicking down doors, saving the day. But no one ever tells you about who built that image, and at what cost. That image was carefully crafted by one man. Hoover didn't just run the FBI, he was the FBI. From the time he took control in 1924 until his death in 1972, he held on to power with this icy, obsessive grip. 8 U.S. presidents came and went while Hoover remained firmly in his office untouched, unchallenged. That's not a public servant. That's a dynasty. And here's where it gets creepy. The guy wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was a master manipulator. He knew how to use fear, shame, secrets, and he weaponized them. Against political rivals, celebrities, activists, even ordinary people. And we're not talking theory here. This was real. Lives were ruined. Movements were crushed. Some people just disappeared. But the wildest part. So much of it happened legally, or at least in the gray area that powerful people love to operate in. He built a surveillance state before we even had a name for it. And yet, for decades, he was worshipped, praised, treated like a hero. His name was on buildings, his face was on magazine covers. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the man was hoarding secrets, blackmailing politicians, and literally rewriting history to suit his narrative. So yeah, that's what we're talking about today. We're going to peel back the layers of the myth, take a long, hard look at the man behind the badge, and maybe ask ourselves how many more Hoovers are out there right now, hiding behind patriotism, public service, and the silence of those too afraid to speak. This story isn't about nostalgia. It's not about glorifying old headlines. It's about power control and the terrifying things people will do to hold on to both. Let's begin. Chapter 2. Origins of Control. You know, when you look at someone like Hoover, a man who practically ruled behind the curtain for 50 years, it's easy to think he was born into that power. Like maybe he came from some rich political dynasty, or had connections in high places from day one. But no, that's not how his story starts. J. Edgar Hoover was born in 1895, right in Washington, D.C. His father worked for the government, and so did his mother. They weren't rich, they weren't powerful, but they believed in order, structure, and rules, especially his mother, Annie Hoover. And let me tell you, she wasn't just strict, she was intense. She drilled it into him early: appearances matter. Reputation matters. You follow the rules and you do not embarrass the family. Ever. And I don't think that idea ever left him. In fact, I think it became the core of who he was. He was a quiet kid, Not especially athletic, not exactly popular, but extremely driven, and he had this problem with stuttering. It's one of those details that feels small, but when you think about a boy growing up in a house obsessed with control, obsessed with perfection, it makes sense that a stutter would haunt him. And instead of letting it define him, Hoover found a way to master it. He trained himself to speak faster. He practiced relentlessly trying to sound confident and smooth. It wasn't just about talking, it was about not showing weakness. Ever. He studied law and library science at George Washington University, yes, library science. And that's where things start getting interesting. While most people overlook that detail, it turns out being a librarian gave Hoover one crucial advantage: access. Access to information, to systems, to the idea that if you could organize the right facts, you could control the narrative. He learned how to catalog lives before he ever put on a badge. And then came his first real opportunity. At just 23, he got a job at the Department of Justice in the Alien Enemy Bureau during World War I. Basically, his job was to round up and investigate immigrants from countries America considered threats. Germans, Austrians, people with accents, strange names. And this is where the pattern starts to form. He got a taste for power, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind where you keep files, where you watch, where you make a list and you never forget who's on it. He was efficient, cold, merciless. And the higher-ups loved it. He wasn't a politician, but he understood politics. He knew that fear was a tool, and if you could manage fear control, what people were afraid of, you could shape policy, shape careers, shape history. And that's exactly what he did. By the early 1920s, America was starting to panic about communism. The Russian Revolution had just happened. Labor unions were striking. Anarchist bombings were making headlines. People were scared. And Hoover was watching it all with laser focus. He saw an opportunity. Fear needed a manager. And Hoover, still in his 20s, was ready to volunteer. That's when he helped lead the infamous Palmer raids. Raids that would mark the beginning of something much darker. Something that would eventually define the FBI. And define Hoover himself. But we'll get to that. First, just let that sink in. A young man with a stutter raised by a mother who worshipped order and loathed embarrassment learns to control people by collecting information, by building files, not friendships. He didn't climb the ladder of power, he built his own. And that ladder, it was made of paper, files, dossiers, secrets. And secrets, my friend, are a dangerous kind of power. Chapter 3. Fear as Fuel. The Palmer Raids. It's strange how easily fear can spread when people are already on edge. And in the early 1900s, America was a pressure cooker. Labor strikes were erupting across the country. People were marching in the streets, demanding better wages, better hours, basic rights. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the Russian Revolution had just turned the world upside down, and words like communism and anarchism were starting to sound like a death sentence in American ears. This was the moment J. Edgar Hoover had been waiting for. He wasn't a household name, yet not even close, but inside the Department of Justice, he was already making waves. Young, methodical, and absolutely ruthless. And most importantly, he understood fear. Not just how to feel it, but how to use it. That would become his signature move. Enter Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. After a series of bombings across the country, some of which targeted government officials, including Palmer himself, he declared war on what he called the Red Menace. He was convinced that radical leftist groups were plotting to overthrow the U.S. government, and he needed someone to help lead the charge. Someone who didn't flinch, someone who didn't hesitate. He chose Hoover. Hoover took the assignment and ran with it. Hard. He built what was essentially the government's first centralized database of radicals, immigrants, and so-called enemies of the state. He didn't just gather names, he created files, thousands of them, based on political affiliation, foreign origin rumors, suspicions, gossip. Then came the raids. Between late 1919 and early 1920, Hoover coordinated what would later be known as the Palmer Raids, a series of mass arrests across dozens of cities. Over 10,000 people were rounded up. Many were beaten, detained without warrants, denied legal counsel, deported some without ever having a formal hearing. And here's the thing that really gets me: most of them hadn't done anything illegal. Their only crime was being feared. Being foreign, being different. I mean, imagine that. Imagine someone knocks on your door in the middle of the night, drags you away from your family, accuses you of plotting to overthrow the government, and you've never even held a sign at a protest. That's what Hoover orchestrated. That's how he earned his stripes. And you know what's terrifying? It worked. The public was scared. The media played along. Politicians praised the crackdown. No one was asking questions. No one wanted to look weak on radicalism. And behind the scenes, Hoover was quietly carving out his empire, one secret file at a time. Now, eventually, the Palmer raids began to backfire. Judges started throwing out cases. Public backlash grew. Even the Supreme Court raised concerns. Palmer's political career nosedived, but Hoover, he walked away clean. Not only clean, but promoted. He was seen as efficient, organized, loyal. The man who could handle chaos, the man who could make the boogeyman disappear. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about Hoover doing a job. This was about Hoover learning the playbook, learning that fear is the fastest way to power, and that if you dress it up in law and order, people won't just accept it, they'll applaud it. So here we are, it's 1920. Hoover is barely in his mid-20s. He's just helped orchestrate one of the largest mass violations of civil liberties in U.S. history. And instead of being held accountable, he's handed more responsibility. That moment, that silence from the public, that approval from the government, that's the moment Hoover stopped being a bureaucrat and started becoming something else entirely. A man who didn't just enforce the law, but quietly rewrote it. Chapter 4. Rebranding Justice. Hoover's PR Empire. You know how we all grew up thinking the FBI was kind of glamorous, like these sharp-dressed agents solving impossible crimes, catching serial killers, cracking codes? That image is everywhere in movies, books, even Halloween costumes. But here's what most people don't realize: that image, it didn't just happen. It was manufactured. And the man behind that myth was J. Edgar Hoover. After the Palmer raids, Hoover could have faded into the background like so many other government men of his time. But he didn't. He did the opposite. He expanded. He took the chaos and controversy of that moment and used it to reinvent the very idea of what law enforcement looked like in America. It started with the Bureau of Investigation, which wasn't even called the FBI yet. Back then, it was small, underfunded, and honestly kind of a mess. But Hoover saw an opportunity. If he could clean it up, give it structure, give it style, he could sell it to the public like a brand. So he got to work. He standardized procedures. He required agents to wear suits, be college-educated, undergo rigorous training. He was obsessed with discipline and appearance, no facial hair, no drinking, no scandals. It was like he wanted to create an army of Hoover clones, polished, quiet, obedient. And then came the real magic trick. He turned the FBI into entertainment. Hoover understood something that most government officials didn't at the time: the power of media. Radio was booming. Magazines were everywhere. And Hollywood was gold. So he made friends in all the right places. He worked with filmmakers, journalists, even comic book writers to shape the FBI's public image. He reviewed scripts. He gave access to official stories as long as they showed agents in a heroic light. It's no accident that in almost every FBI movie from the 30s and 40s, the agents are clean-cut good guys, saving the day with moral clarity. That was Hoover's doing. He wasn't just managing a bureau, he was curating a fantasy. But behind the curtain, it was a different story. While the public was falling in love with this idea of the FBI as America's noble watchdog, Hoover was quietly building a surveillance state. He was expanding files, digging into people's personal lives, celebrities, politicians, civil rights leaders, even average citizens. If you spoke out, if you got noticed, if you challenged the status quo in any way, chances are Hoover had a file on you. And that's what makes this part of his story so eerie. Because it wasn't just about law enforcement, it was about control. By crafting this perfect, untouchable image of the Bureau, Hoover made it nearly impossible to question what was happening behind the scenes. Who would dare challenge the good guys in suits? Who would suspect that the man feeding crime stats to the press was also hiding wiretaps in hotel rooms? He blurred the line between truth and propaganda so effectively even Congress was reluctant to investigate him. Presidents were afraid to fire him. The public, they adored him. And I get it. When you're scared of communists, of anarchists, of organized crime, you cling to someone who looks like they have answers. Hoover gave America that illusion. Clean lines, clear heroes, simple narratives, but none of it was simple. And deep down, I think Hoover knew it. That's why he kept spinning the story year after year. He had to keep the illusion going, because if it cracked even a little, everything underneath every file, every wiretap, every illegal search would come spilling out. So, while America saw a polished agency that stood for truth and justice, Hoover was quietly rewriting the rules of both. And no one, not the press, not the courts, not even the presidents, had the nerve to stop him. Chapter 5. Secrets. Silence and the machinery of control. At some point it stopped being about justice. That's the thought that kept circling in my head as I dug deeper into J. Edgar Hoover's legacy. Because everything he built, the clean suits, the media strategy, the reputation for law and order, wasn't just about protecting the public. It was about protecting himself and his grip on power. And how did he protect it? With secrets? Thousands of them. This is the part that makes my stomach turn. Hoover wasn't just collecting evidence on criminals. He was collecting dirt on everyone. He had files on senators, movie stars, civil rights activists, even sitting presidents. And these weren't just professional records. These were deeply personal. Affairs, addictions, sexual orientation, private conversations. If there was something to know, Hoover wanted to know it. And once he knew it, he never let it go. He built a massive filing system, literally rooms full of confidential memos, wiretap transcripts, photographs, surveillance notes. It became known as his personal and confidential files. Though let's be real, Blackmail Vault would have been a better name. It's hard to even wrap your head around how far this went. He had agents following Martin Luther King Jr., recording his phone calls, bugging his hotel rooms, not to gather criminal evidence, but to discredit him, to humiliate him, to control him. And he didn't stop at surveillance. Hoover actually sent King an anonymous letter posing as a fellow black activist telling him he should commit suicide. Can you imagine that the director of the FBI essentially telling the most prominent civil rights leader in America to end his life? That's not law enforcement, that's psychological warfare. And yet, nobody stopped him. Why? Because the people who could stop him were already compromised, or at least believed they could be. Hoover had built such an intricate web of fear and control that even the most powerful people in the country treaded carefully around him. Presidents came and went. Truman didn't trust him. Kennedy wanted to get rid of him. Nixon feared him. But none of them fired him. It's not just that Hoover had leverage. It's that he was the system. He had shaped the FBI in his image, paranoid, secretive, ruthless. And now the system protected him. There's something deeply unsettling about watching democracy bend to the will of one man, not because he was elected, not because he held a gun, but because he had information. Private, painful, career-ending information. And it wasn't just about power for power's sake. Hoover truly believed that he knew what was best for the country, that his moral code should override the Constitution, that if someone was dangerous, that was justification enough to violate their rights. But here's the problem with that kind of thinking: everyone becomes dangerous eventually. Once you start operating in shadows, once you tell yourself that the end always justifies the means, there's no line you won't cross. Hoover didn't just cross the line, he erased it. And we let him. I think that's the hardest truth to face in all of this. We let him become untouchable. We wanted the illusion of safety so badly we gave one man the keys to a surveillance empire and asked no questions about what he was doing behind those locked doors. What started as law enforcement had become something else entirely. It had become a machine. And the man feeding that machine wasn't just chasing justice anymore. He was feeding his need to know everything, to own every secret, to silence every threat. And in doing so, he became the very thing he claimed to fight. Chapter 6. The Mask He Wore. There's something uniquely haunting about watching someone attack the very thing they might be hiding in themselves. Like watching a man set fire to a house knowing his childhood bedroom is still inside. That's the feeling I couldn't shake when I looked into J. Edgar Hoover's relentless crusade against the LGBTQ plus community and the quiet, persistent rumors that he might have been a closeted gay man himself. Now let me be clear. I don't care who someone loves. That's not the point. The point is how Hoover used identity, his and others, as a weapon. And how much damage it did. During Hoover's reign, simply being gay was enough to destroy your career, your family, even your freedom. In the 1950s and 60s, the government was actively purging LGBTQ plus employees, calling them security risks, claiming they were vulnerable to blackmail. It was known as the Lavender Scare. You've probably heard of the Red Scare, McCarthyism, communists hiding in every corner, but the Lavender Scare. It was quieter, more insidious, and it ruined thousands of lives. And guess who helped lead that charge? Yep, Hoover. Under his leadership, the FBI surveilled suspected gay men and women, infiltrated gay bars, raided homes, created lists, literal lists of names to be watched, interrogated, fired, or worse. People were publicly humiliated, outed to their families. Some took their own lives. And all the while, the man orchestrating it all was living a life full of contradictions. Now let's talk about the rumors. They've been around for decades, and no, we don't have hard proof, no tape, no confession, no smoking gun. But there were whispers, persistent ones. Hoover never married. He was intensely close to Clyde Tolson, his longtime deputy and constant companion. The two dined together, vacationed together, even wore matching suits. When Hoover died, he left most of his estate to Tolson. And Tolson, by the way, accepted the American flag that draped Hoover's coffin. Could they have simply been close friends, of course. But in the context of who Hoover was, what he did to other people for less, it's impossible not to wonder. Because if the rumors were true, that means Hoover lived his entire life in hiding. Not just hiding from the public, but from himself. And instead of using that experience to show compassion to protect others from persecution, he turned it outward. He made it policy. He made it punishment. He knew exactly how to weaponize shame because he carried it with him every single day. And this is where the story stops being about politics or surveillance or even crime. This is about pain, the pain of living a double life, the pain of projecting your fear onto the world around you instead of facing it head on. I'm not saying this to excuse Hoover, not at all. What he did was calculated, cruel, and devastating. But I do think we need to understand it. Because the truth is, people in power often use their own insecurities to justify oppression, and they'll bury it so deep that they convince even themselves it's not there. That's the kind of rot that spreads. What if Hoover had lived in a time where he didn't have to hide? Would history have looked different? Would lives have been spared? I don't know. Maybe. But that's not the world he built. Instead, he built a world where secrets were deadly, where love could be used as evidence, where identity was dangerous, and the most tragic part, he was one of the victims of that world too. He just chose to make sure he wasn't alone. Chapter 7. The silence on organized crime. There's this strange gap in Hoover's record that I couldn't stop thinking about. I mean, here's a guy who had files on everyone. Civil rights leaders, politicians, Hollywood stars. He hunted radicals, surveilled protesters, even sent anonymous letters trying to ruin people's lives. But when it came to one of the biggest threats to American security at the time, the mafia, he stayed oddly quiet. And that silence, it speaks volumes. Organized crime in the United States wasn't some vague rumor by the 1950s. It was real, it was violent, and it was growing fast. Families controlled entire industries, gambling labor unions, construction politics, bribes, extortion disappearances. Cities like New York, Chicago, Las Vegas, they were crawling with mob activity. Everybody knew it. Everybody. Except apparently J. Edgar Hoover. For years, the FBI barely touched the mafia. No major investigations, no coordinated takedowns. Hoover even refused to publicly admit that the mafia existed. Let that sink in. The most powerful law enforcement figure in America wouldn't say the word mafia, and the question that haunted me was why one theory is denial. Maybe Hoover didn't want to admit that such a powerful criminal network could operate right under his nose. Maybe acknowledging it would tarnish his image as a man who had total control. But another theory, the darker one, is blackmail. Some historians and former mob insiders have hinted that the mafia might have had their own dirt on Hoover. And if that's true, it changes everything. There were whispers, stories about compromising photos, private behaviors, secret meetings. I don't know if they're true, and honestly, we may never know. But think about this: Hoover built his entire empire on using secrets against other people. What happens when someone else has a secret on him? It's a terrifying irony. And if the mob had leverage, real or just perceived, it would explain a lot. The silence, the inaction, the fact that until the late 1950s, the FBI barely lifted a finger against organized crime, even as journalists, police departments, and the Senate were sounding the alarm. It wasn't until 1957, after a chance police raid in a small town in upstate New York, that the scale of the mafia became undeniable. The infamous Appalachian meeting, dozens of high-ranking mobsters all in one place, caught off guard by local law enforcement. It was like someone had ripped the curtain off a secret society, and Hoover, he couldn't pretend anymore. Suddenly, the FBI started building organized crime units. Surveillance increased. Wiretaps were authorized. But even then, it felt forced. Late. Like a reaction to public pressure, not a genuine commitment to justice. It's wild to think that the man who weaponized gossip against civil rights leaders showed so little interest in the people who were literally gunning each other down in the streets. And the cost was enormous. Because while Hoover was chasing political dissidents and hoarding files on celebrities, the mafia was building empires, real ones. And ordinary people paid the price. It makes you wonder how different things might have been if the FBI had treated organized crime with the same obsession they gave to activists and protesters. How much blood could have been avoided? How many communities might have been spared? But Hoover's silence, that was a choice. Whether it was made out of pride politics or personal fear, we'll never know for sure. But the consequences are written all over American history. And the scariest part? The man who claimed to know everyone's secrets may have had his own. One so dangerous even he couldn't face them. Chapter 8. The Man Who Wouldn't Let Go. Power is addictive, not in the way people usually say it like a figure of speech, but in the way it actually changes a person, their brain, their sense of right and wrong. And I don't think anyone embodied that more than J. Edgar Hoover in the final years of his life. By the time the 1960s rolled around, Hoover had been in charge of the FBI for nearly 40 years. That's longer than most Americans had been alive at the time. Presidents came and went, 8 of them to be exact, but Hoover stayed, unshakable, untouchable. But something was shifting. You could feel it in the air. The world outside Hoover's carefully controlled FBI was changing fast. The civil rights movement, anti-war protests, counterculture, women's liberation. Young people were demanding change, questioning authority, refusing to be silenced. And to Hoover, that looked like chaos, rebellion, a threat. He didn't understand it. More importantly, he didn't want to. Instead of adapting, Hoover doubled down. He saw every activist as a radical, every movement as a front for communism, every new voice as an enemy. He began to isolate himself. He trusted fewer and fewer people. He spent more time reading newspapers for mentions of his own name than focusing on national security. He ordered more surveillance, more infiltration, more files. As the world opened up, Hoover shut down. He especially hated the press. Reporters were getting bolder, digging deeper. And more than ever, they were asking the one question Hoover had managed to avoid for decades: who holds him accountable? The answer was no one. Congress was afraid of him. Presidents tiptoed around him. Even within the FBI, people were scared to challenge him. He was the architect of their careers and just as easily their destruction. And that fear, Hoover fed on it. He refused to retire. Even as he aged, even as his health declined, he held on to his position like it was oxygen. People talked behind closed doors how out of touch he'd become, how outdated his tactics were. But no one said it out loud. No one dared. And while all this was happening, while the country was facing war, political scandal, and social unrest, Hoover was still obsessing over the same things: surveillance, morality, loyalty, control. It was as if he believed the country owed him something, as if after decades of protecting America from its enemies, he had earned the right to become one himself. And honestly, maybe we let him. Because when someone stays in power that long with no term limit, no oversight, and no transparency, the system stops being democratic. It becomes something else, something darker, something more fragile than we want to admit. And in Hoover's case, that fragility was hidden behind a polished suit, a tight grip, and decades of fear-based silence. He didn't just build an institution, he became it. And when someone becomes the system, removing them feels like tearing out the foundation, even when it's long overdue. Chapter 9. When the curtain fell, it happened on May 17, 1972. After nearly half a century in power, J. Edgar Hoover died quietly in his sleep at his Washington, D.C. home. Just like that, no warning, no spectacle, no last dramatic scene. One day, the most powerful unelected man in American government was simply gone. And the country, it didn't know how to react. On paper, it was just a death announcement. A man aged 77 died of a heart attack. But behind closed doors, there was chaos, relief, confusion, fear. Some mourned, others exhaled, because no one, not even presidents, had truly planned for a post-Hoover FBI. For the first time in nearly 50 years, the system he built had no one at the wheel, and the question hit hard, fast, and loud: what had he left behind? The answer came quickly, and it was messy. Within hours of Hoover's death, his longtime secretary, Helen Gandy, began destroying documents. Thousands of them. Some say she worked around the clock for weeks. Quiet. Efficient, just like Hoover trained her, and no one stopped her. Think about that. The head of the FBI dies, and before anyone can take control of his files, before Congress, before the Justice Department, his closest aide is already cleaning house. People knew these files existed. The infamous personal and confidential files, the ones Hoover kept in his office separate from official records. These weren't your standard memos or case files. These were secrets, blackmail material, leverage, names, photos, letters, things no one was ever supposed to see. And for the most part, we didn't. By the time the government stepped in, most of it was gone. What survived, though, still painted a disturbing picture. The surveillance of civil rights leaders, the letters to Martin Luther King, the extensive files on political figures, journalists, even entertainers. It wasn't law enforcement, it was social control. Conducted in the shadows, justified by fear and protected by Hoover's paranoia. For decades, people had asked, was Hoover really that bad? After his death, we stopped asking. Because now, we had evidence. Congress finally began to investigate. Hearings were held, reforms were proposed. There was talk of term limits for the FBI director. A realization, finally, that no one should have that much power for that long, especially not in secret. But here's the thing that still haunts me. Even in death, Hoover kept his grip on history. So much was lost in that purge. So many unanswered questions. So many lives that were monitored, manipulated, destroyed. Without justice, without apology, without a name on the file. And the man responsible, he got a state funeral. Presidents spoke at his memorial. Flags were flown at half-staff. And Clyde Tolson, his constant companion, was there, front row, grieving the man who shaped his life and legacy. Hoover died before Watergate broke, before the Church Committee exposed the full scale of FBI surveillance, before the word COINTELPRO became public knowledge. He never had to face the consequences, never saw the backlash. He died a legend. But history has a funny way of catching up. Because over time, the myth faded, the truth leaked, and the country began to reckon with what it had allowed, what it had praised, what it had feared into silence. J. Edgar Hoover didn't just shape the FBI, he shaped the limits of American democracy, what it could tolerate, what it could excuse, what it could ignore. And when the curtain finally fell, what we saw wasn't a hero. It was a man who confused control with justice, and a country that let him. Chapter 10: The Echoes of Power. Sometimes the scariest thing about history isn't what happened, it's how easily it happened. How one man who was never elected, never truly challenged, managed to reshape the entire landscape of American law enforcement for nearly half a century, and how we, the people, either applauded it, ignored it, or were too afraid to question it. That man was J. Edgar Hoover, and even now, decades after his death, we're still living in the shadows he helped build. Hoover didn't just run the FBI, he was the FBI. For so long that no one remembered what the Bureau looked like without him, and that's what made him so dangerous. His presence became the status quo, his fears became policy, his secrets became leverage, his silence became the cost of survival. What really sticks with me is how much of his legacy was built on fear, not just fear of crime or communism, but a deeper fear. Fear of change, of dissent, of vulnerability. He feared people who questioned authority. He feared movements that didn't look like the world he wanted to preserve. He feared being exposed, being judged, being seen. So he built a system that punished visibility. He targeted people who stood up, who loved differently, who demanded rights, justice, truth. And in the name of national security, he watched them, harassed them, silenced them. And the tragedy is, he probably thought he was doing the right thing. I think about that a lot, how dangerous it is when one person believes they are the sole moral compass for an entire country, when they believe their instincts are above the law, when they confuse control with order, and worse, when no one dares to stop them. Hoover's story isn't just about the past. It's about the systems we still live in today. It's about the way power protects itself, about how secrecy can rot an institution from the inside, about what happens when we trade accountability for comfort. Even now, remnants of his methods remain. Surveillance programs that began in secrecy continue in new forms. Agencies still struggle with transparency. And the question of who watches the watchers is just as relevant as it was in Hoover's time. The man is gone, but the machine he built, parts of it, are still running. And maybe that's the true legacy, not just the scandals, or the files, or the fear, but the fact that we let it happen. For so long. Because deep down, part of us believed that giving up a little freedom was worth it, if it meant someone else was in control. But here's the thing about control. Once you give it away, it's hard to take back. So what do we do now? We remember, we question. We hold power accountable, not just in the headlines, but in the quiet rooms where real decisions are made. We stop worshiping the myth of the strongman and start asking harder questions about the cost of silence. Because history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it echoes. And if we're not listening closely, we'll miss the warning signs. Hoover isn't just a figure from the past, he's a mirror, and it's up to us to decide what we see staring back. So now you've heard the story, not of a killer in the night, not of a robbery gone wrong, but of a man who held an entire nation in the palm of his hand through fear, silence, and control. J. Edgar Hoover never fired a weapon. He didn't have to. He used secrets as bullets and surveillance as chains. And for nearly half a century we let him do it. We called it safety. We called it patriotism. But it was power, pure, concentrated, unaccountable power, and the echoes of that still shape our world. What would have happened if someone had stood up sooner, if truth had mattered more than fear? If oversight had existed and courage hadn't been so rare? We can't change history, but we can learn from it. So the next time someone says they have nothing to hide, so why should they worry, remember this story. Because when power isn't questioned, it doesn't stay still. It grows. Thank you for listening. I'm glad you're here. Stay curious, stay critical, and never stop asking who's watching the ones in charge. This is True Crime Echoes.